this sweater reminds me that Fred Rogers weighed 143 pounds all of his life, so I think I need to get to that. It's a little bit tight on me. Oh, we're having fun learning about Fred Rogers and Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Last week we had a lesson about love and blessings. And those two words, love and blessings, Mr. Rogers certainly presented in his life and on his TV show. Today we shift to the neighborhood. Now, last week before I share with you a couple stories from the biography, I need to tell you a little bit about Fred Rogers' background. Last week we talked about how he grew up in Leypoldt, Pennsylvania. And it's in Leypoldt where we learned something that many of you may not already know. Now, let me see a show of hands. How many of you have seen the documentary? I know, Ed, a few of you have. I just came on. I was on PBS last night. Also, HBO is showing it, so we've had some folks seeing it. So you may be familiar with some of these things. Well, one of the things that many people may not be aware of is that Fred Rogers came from wealth. And when I mean money, I mean lots of it. His father, the Rogers family, had controlling interest in quite a bit of industrial Pennsylvania. His mom's side of the family, the McFeelys, owned quite a few companies also in the same area. His parents were friends with the Mellons of Carnegie Mellon. And his parents' foundation, the Rogers Foundation, had a controlling interest in a company called Radio Corporation of America, also known as RCA. His dad sat on several boards of quite a few manufacturing and financial industries. But to understand the roots of Fred Rogers' neighborhood, you need to know the story of the Lindbergh baby. Some of you know Charles Lindbergh, familiar with that guy. He flew first person to fly solo from the United States over to Europe. And so he gained quite a bit of fame, but also a bit of money as well. But he is probably also more familiar with having a child that was kidnapped and murdered. And so this affected the Rogers family greatly. In fact, wealthy families of the time were worried that this was going to happen to them. And so every day, Fred Rogers was driven to school by a chauffeur. At lunchtime, that chauffeur would actually come and pick him up, take him home, and then take him back to school. Now, remember last week I shared with you that the kids that he went to school with kind of resented his wealth and where he came from. Well, you get an idea as to where that comes from. Now, a little caveat here about his parents. Jim and Nancy Rogers did not hoard their wealth. There are plenty of stories about how his family was very generous to not only the community, but the church that they went to. And these acts of service and these acts of charity truly affected Fred Rogers greatly. But as you know, sometimes that doesn't always trickle down to children. And sometimes you know how kids can be. So let me share with you a couple stories about the neighborhood. When Fred was driven home for lunch, he often spent lunch breaks in his puppet theater in the attic of his parents' mansion, entertaining a friendlier classmate who'd come home with him in a chauffeur-driven car. Here's another story. Back in the 1930s, when Fred was growing up, living in a neighborhood meant safety, security, comfort, and health. Despite his problems in Leypoldt, young Rogers had a piece of geography, a piece of the town that was his own. He had neighbors and relatives who understood him, who helped him when his parents didn't understand, who took him into the library to find books that he liked, who rescued him when he was bullied on the street. And then one more story for you. The neighborhood meant familiar and comforting sights and sounds. The clang of the trolley coming up the hill, the sound of trucks making deliveries to the shops, the smoke belching from industrial chimneys that said, "There are jobs here." His parents' house and the big backyard behind it. His grandparents' house, the school building where he learned each and every day. The fabric of that neighborhood gave the young boy in the 1930s a sense of place that was profoundly reassuring at a time when he felt acutely his own shyness and the pangs of loneliness. And it was this kind of neighborhood that he created for young viewers. So, when you hear and see the trolley, and when you see the brick streets, And you see the brick buildings on Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. This is the same place. This is the same neighborhood that Fred Rogers grew up in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. This neighborhood, he learned that it was okay to share one's feelings. And more importantly, that it was okay for children to feel understood and valued. You see, Fred Rogers loved his hometown, even though at times he could be unhappy. In the neighborhood, in the Mr. Rogers neighborhood, he used his memories of Latrobe to create really an idealized version of the town, where children could be understood and valued. And this program that he had incorporated most of the highly imaginative elements that we remember from the show. The puppets, the sneakers. Let me a little digress here, tell you a story about the sneakers. It's a great one. The very first show that Mr. Rogers put on was held in the basement of the University of Pittsburgh. And pretty much Mr. Rogers had to do just about everything. Run the camera, play the organ, and do various things. He had one other helper. And as he was moving around the basement, his shoes squeaked on the floor. The show was taped live. So what did he do? He changed his shoes. And thus he incorporated that into Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. No, the little caveat there, I had to share it with you. Let's see, the sneakers, the sweater, the trolley, the slow pace and quiet manner that invited children into the world of this gentle man, who looked right into their eyes and talked their language. At the start of every show, Mr. Rogers sang, "It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood." The Mr. Rogers anthem, composed by Rogers like all the other songs in the program, signaled to millions of kids watching that Fred Rogers valued them just the way you are. The song was not only reassuring, it was kind of catchy. So you're probably humming that song right now, would be my guess. So what do we find in the neighborhood? Well, as we talked about last week, Scripture, the church, God, and Jesus played a very significant role in the Rogers family. Fred Rogers eventually went on and got his MDiv from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He was also ordained by the Presbyterian Church. But his sense of the neighborhood, I think, is best described by something the Apostle Paul wrote. So Jan's going to read us a passage out of Scripture.
Today's reading will come from 1 Corinthians 12, chapter 12, verses 12 through 31. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are only one body, so it is with Christ. For in the one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. Indeed, the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot would say, "Because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body," that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear would say, "Because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body," that would not make it any less the part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole body were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each of them as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many members, yet one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, "I have no need of you," nor again the head to the feet, "I have no need of you." On the contrary, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and those members of the body that we think less honorable we clothe with greater honor, and our less respectable members are treated with greater respect, whereas our more respectable members do not need this. But God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member, that there may be no dissension within the body, but the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. Now, you are the body of Christ, and individually members of it. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then deeds of power, then gifts of healing, forms of assistance, forms of leadership, various kinds of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all possess gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret? But strive for the greater gifts, and I will show you a still more excellent way.
each have our gifts. We each have value. And we each need to know that we are adopted and accepted by God. We're going to watch another clip from the documentary. And so would you go ahead and show it here?
Of people looking at Fred and all his eccentricity and singularity and trying to basically say, well, that can't be. He has to be this way.
The universal question about Fred is, was he that way in real life? And the answer is yes.
Francois Clemens, hi, welcome.
Thank you. How you doing?
Fine, how are you today?
Fine.
My feet were tired, so I thought I'd just soak them for a while in this water.
Does it make him feel better?
It does. Would you like to try?
Sure. On the show, he would say, I love you just the way you are. One day I said, Fred, were you talking to me? And he looked at me and he said, yes, I've been talking to you for 2 years, and you finally heard me today. And I just collapsed into his arms. I started crying. That's when I knew that I loved him. There are many ways to say I love you. There are many ways to say I care about. No man had ever told me that he loved me like that. I needed to hear it all my life. My dad never told me. My stepfather never told me. So, from then on, he became my surrogate father.
I'm so proud of you, Francois.
Oh, thank you, Fred.
Can I help you here?
Thank you.
The people who have had a lot of struggle in their lives, those are the people who really impress me.
Officer Clemens, played here by Francois Clemens, said, the icon Fred Rogers not only was showing my brown skin in the tub with his white skin and his 2 friends, but as I was getting out of that tub, he was helping me dry my feet. The scene, which the two revisited in 1993, and actually the clip that you just saw was from the 1993 version, was in their last episode together, touched Clemens in a way he hadn't expected. I think he, Fred Rogers, was making a very strong statement. That was his way. I still was not convinced that Officer Clemens could have a positive influence in the neighborhood, and in the real world neighborhood, but I think I was proved wrong. Now, you probably picked up this next quote from the documentary here, and that this was more than just 2 actors waiting in a pool. This was more than just 2 people with a different color pigment of skin. For Mr. Clemens, it was much, much more. Let me share with you from the biography. At the end of the episode, when Mr. Rogers takes his sneakers off and hangs up his sweater, as usual, he says, you make every day a special day by being you, and I like you just the way you are. Francois Clemens looked over at Rogers as he said it. As Rogers walked over, Clemens asked, Fred, were you talking to me? And he said, yes, I've been talking to you for years, but you heard me today. It was like telling me I'm okay as a human being. That was one of the most meaningful experiences I've ever had. You see, Fred Rogers was all about creating the neighborhood. You know, I found myself as I was reading his biography, really understanding why the neighborhood was so important to Mr. Rogers. I think maybe it was this torn in me. I'm always interested in knowing why a person does this, or a community does that, or why someone this person has a trigger and it doesn't trigger that person. But for Fred Rogers, the community, the neighborhood, was and is important. And we all know that he lived out these ideals of the neighborhood. Now, do you remember something that I said last week? Fred Rogers didn't need to go to seminary. It is my belief that Fred is a walking embodiment of the life of Christ. But seminary gave him the education, the ability to describe why the neighborhood is important, why we need a community of support, why the church is invaluable in this neighborhood. For we, the church, become this neighborhood illustrating Christian service. You see, in Fred Rogers, he imbued the delights of Christian service. Fred took great pleasure in everyday acts of thoughtfulness and kindliness throughout his life. And when he met a stranger who needed help or friendship, he would drop everything to offer his time and attention. There's a typical story about this. About Fred's giving nature came from a woman who once worked as an intern on the Mr. Rogers neighborhood. She said she recalled that when she accompanied Fred on a trip to Boston, they were scheduled to have dinner at the home of an influential executive at WGBH, the public television station in Boston. A limousine had been hired to take them to the executive's home. When they got there, the limo driver asked Fred when he should pick them up after dinner. Instead, Fred invited him in, much to the bewilderment of the hostess. After dinner, he sat up front in the limo with the driver, a man named Billy, to get to know him. Before the evening was over, Fred and the intern went back to Billy's house in West Roxbury to meet his parents. Fred came in and played the piano as people streamed in from around the neighborhood to listen. A few years later, when Fred learned that Billy was in the hospital dying, he called to talk with him and to say goodbye. You see, each one of us is needed to live out the lessons of the neighborhood. Now, obviously, the Apostle Paul uses different words when he is describing this to the church in Corinth. There, Paul describes each one of us as being part of the body. And each one of us in the body is no less than another. Each one of us contributes. So you see, some of us are called to use puppets on a TV show. Some of us are called to listen to people's problems and issues and joys and concerns. Some are called to balance financial books. Some of us are called to make sure that the church is kept clean. Some of us are called to invite a guest into the church. Some of us are called to just have patience with children. Some of us are called to support the church with our wealth. Some of us are called to invite a stranger in and to sit with them. And some of us are called to help the hungry with a meal. Paul, the Apostle Paul, was familiar with quite a few neighborhoods. And our Bible contains many of these letters where he would write to these neighborhoods throughout the Roman Empire. But there was one neighborhood that he wrote, and he said something very unique to the neighborhood in Rome. He said, "We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. Prophecy in proportion to faith, ministry and ministering, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation, the giver in generosity, the leader in diligence, the compassionate in cheerfulness." The neighborhood has many different elements and many different people. But there's one thing undergirding all of it, and that goes back to the way we treat each other. And I think that's the why. The neighborhood doesn't work with divisions and discord. The neighborhood only functions with encouragement. For example, if a child would write Mr. Rogers into the Mr. Rogers neighborhood, sometimes Fred would send a note to the parent as well. One of the most treasured letters was written by a mom just before Christmas one year to say that her teenagers and she and her husband lived in a trailer. They had no money and really needed help with Christmas presents. Could Fred autograph pictures for her kids? Fred sent back an autographed picture and a letter saying how fortunate your children are to have such a caring mother. She wrote back a letter that was so incredibly touching. How she cried because she never thought of her children as being fortunate to have her as a mother. And this was not a one-time deal for Mr. Rogers. He felt it was his duty as a Christ follower to be in service for the people of God. His biographer wrote, "The Presbyterian values hard work, responsibility, and caring for others. Parsimony," I had to look up this word, which just means extreme unwillingness to spend money or use resources, duty to family, ethical clarity, a strong sense of mission, and a relentless sense of service to God drove every moment of Fred Rogers' life. Now that certainly gets at the heart of who Fred Rogers was, how devoted he was to his Presbyterian way of practice. But it really doesn't explain the why the neighborhood was so important, until you look at this quote. Lisa Dormeyer, who worked in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood and later served as a vice president of the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, saw the comparison of Rogers and Jesus in terms of authenticity. I think he had a very Christ-like quality, and that is part of what drew children. Children know a fraud more than anyone. I truly believe he was one of the most authentic and Christ-like people that I ever had known in my life. Just his manner, his ability to listen, everyone you talked to that had an encounter with him, it was a real moment in their lives. I think we found the why. The neighborhood needs to be an authentic place of love, where we connect with one another, where we do not feel harmed or bullied or shamed. The neighborhood needs to be a place that helps you when you feel sad and alone and desperate, and certainly when we need a friend. In 1992, Fred Rogers appeared on the Arsenio Hall show and was asked about the violence that some kids were experiencing in their LA neighborhoods. Arsenio asked Mr. Rogers to respond to these children, and in reply, Fred Rogers quoted his mother, Nancy McFeely Rogers, with advice he would repeat on several occasions on national trauma. Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. Later, he would reiterate, to this day, especially in times of disaster, I remember my mother's words and am always comforted by realizing there are still so many helpers, so many caring people in this world. So the neighborhood consists of helpers and friends and people who are authentic to the Word of God. And the neighborhood doesn't end with the cross and flame. You know your neighbors. I mean, they don't all attend here. Some don't attend anywhere. The neighborhood, something that was so vital to the life of Fred Rogers, that was so elemental to the work of the Apostle Paul, was there even in the final days of Fred Rogers. Towards the end of his life, Mr. Rogers got cancer. And as he lay comatose shortly before he died, his friend, Arch-Abbot Douglas Nowicki, a chancellor at St. Vincent College, came to the Rogers apartment in Pittsburgh to administer the last rites of the Catholic Church. How would Rogers have felt about that? Well, Joanne Rogers, his wife, later explained that because of Fred's embrace of all faiths, he frequently prayed with those of other faiths. He would have been pleased to receive Catholic last rites just before dying as a Presbyterian. The neighborhood has a lot of parts of the body. Some go here, some go there, some go over there, some don't go anywhere, just watch TV. But all of us are needed. All Christ asks for us is to be authentic. Fred Rogers, the Apostle Paul, taught us that. And when we do the neighborhood right, it's more than a trolley, more than brick streets. It's what we do to live out an authentic Christ-like existence.